It started like any other weekend in the quiet suburban neighborhood. The lawns were perfectly trimmed, the flower beds meticulously maintained, and the cul-de-sac gave off the kind of postcard-perfect vibe that outsiders envied. To most, this street represented calm, order, and a sense of community. Families waved at each other, kids rode their bikes up and down the pavement, and the smell of backyard grills filled the air. But beneath that picture-perfect exterior, one neighbor had a very different vision of what the street should be. Her name was Karen. Karen was the kind of neighbor who seemed to believe that every inch of the block existed for her personal comfort. She lived in a two-story brick house with a spotless yard, and she watched the neighborhood like a hawk. Every car parked on the street, every trash can brought out a little too late, every small deviation from her standards. Karen noticed, and Karen complained. The HOA board already knew her name too well because she filled their inbox with endless reports of supposed violations. For a while, most neighbors tried to ignore her. They chalked it up to personality quirks, the kind of meddling that came with living next to someone who had too much time on their hands. But Karen's complaints weren't harmless. They were disruptive, and slowly people began to see that her mission wasn't about rules or order. It was about control. The real trouble started with something so small, so innocent, that most people wouldn't even think twice about it. Kids playing outside. It was early spring, the kind of afternoon where the sun stayed warm a little longer and the street filled with laughter. My kids, along with a few of their friends, were riding bikes, tossing a ball, and drawing chalk art on the sidewalk. It wasn't anything unusual. In fact, it was the kind of scene you'd expect in any family-friendly neighborhood. But for Karen, this was an outrage. She first appeared at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, glaring at the kids like they were vandals. My daughter's chalk drawings, which included flowers, hopscotch squares, and smiley faces, seemed to enrage her more than anything. To Karen, colorful doodles weren't innocent art. They were graffiti. She snapped photos of the sidewalk, muttering under her breath, and then marched back inside. At first, I thought that would be the end of it, but not with Karen. Within hours, an email had been sent to the HOA board, claiming that my kids were causing a nuisance. She described their laughter as excessive noise, and their games as a safety hazard. The irony, of course, was that the kids were playing no louder than the average lawnmower or barking dog, both of which the street had plenty of. The HOA didn't act immediately. They knew Karen's history, and I imagine they rolled their eyes when her message came through. But Karen wasn't done. A few days later, she escalated things further. She actually called the cops. Yes, over kids playing outside. That Saturday, while my kids and their friends were chasing each other around the yard, a police car slowly pulled into the street. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. The officer stepped out, calm and professional, but clearly uncomfortable. He explained that they had received a noise complaint and had to check it out. I couldn't believe it. A noise complaint for children laughing. The officer glanced at the kids, looked back at me, and sighed. He knew this was nonsense, but procedure is procedure, and he had to make a report. Karen stood across the street, smug and self-satisfied, her phone in hand, as if she were documenting the entire event. She looked like she had just won a major victory. The kids were confused, upset, and a little scared. The idea that playing outside could bring the police was something they had never imagined. I reassured them, sent them inside for the time being, and dealt with the officer as politely as I could. When he left, Karen turned and walked back inside, her head held high, as though she had restored order to the world. But what Karen didn't realize was that her actions had consequences. The sight of a police car in the neighborhood had not gone unnoticed. Curtains had been pulled back, neighbors had peeked outside, and whispers began to circulate. People wanted to know why an officer had shown up on such a quiet afternoon. And soon enough, the truth came out. One of my neighbors, a friend of ours who lived 2 doors down, had overheard Karen bragging to another homeowner about calling the cops. She said she was teaching those kids a lesson, and that the street needed peace and quiet. When my neighbor shared this with the rest of us, the mood began to shift. People were no longer just rolling their eyes at Karen's behavior. They were starting to get angry, because it wasn't just about me or my kids. Everyone realized that if Karen could call the police on children, then none of them was safe from her crusade. If she decided someone's dog barked too loudly, or if a barbecue smelled too strong, what would stop her from doing the same again? Karen thought she had silenced my kids, but what she had really done was expose herself. The street was beginning to see her for who she truly was, not a concerned neighbor, but a bully hiding behind complaints and authority. Still, Karen didn't back down. She doubled down. That week, she sent out flyers claiming that excessive noise was lowering property values and hinted that more police involvement might be necessary if things didn't change. The audacity was unbelievable, yet the tide was already turning against her. What Karen hadn't anticipated was that when you pick a fight with kids, you pick a fight with parents, and when parents feel threatened, they don't stay quiet. By the end of that week, whispers had grown into full-blown conversations. Neighbors were discussing Karen openly, and the tone was not sympathetic. For the first time, she was the one under scrutiny, not the family she targeted. And that was only the beginning, because once the neighborhood came together, Karen's little empire of complaints started to crumble. But that part of the story comes later. For now, the street had just witnessed the first real crack in her control, the moment when Karen's obsession with silence pushed her too far. And little did she know, the entire neighborhood was about to push back. After the police visit, things didn't go back to normal the way Karen probably imagined they would. She thought she had sent a warning that the kids would stay inside, that parents would be too intimidated to let them play freely again. For a few days, it almost seemed like she was right. The kids were hesitant to go outside, glancing nervously up and down the street, as though another squad car might appear at any moment. Parents comforted them, reassured them that they hadn't done anything wrong, but the shadow of Karen's actions lingered. But in neighborhoods like ours, silence rarely lasts. Kids are resilient, and their laughter eventually broke through again. By the following weekend, they were outside with chalk, bikes, and basketballs. Their games filled the street with the same joyful noise Karen despised. And that's when something unusual happened. One by one, other families began encouraging their kids to join in. It wasn't planned, at least not at first, but neighbors who had heard what Karen did didn't want her to win. They didn't want a street where children had to tiptoe around her temper, so they sent their kids outside too. What started as a handful of kids became a group, and what had been an ordinary playtime turned into a kind of silent rebellion against Karen's control. From her window, Karen noticed. Her blinds shifted, her curtains twitched, and her figure loomed behind the glass. She stormed outside, phone in hand, snapping photos as though documenting a crime scene. But this time, she wasn't met with nervous parents. She was met with stares. Other adults stood in their yards, arms folded, watching her, not with fear, but with frustration. Karen sent another furious email to the HOA board that very evening. This one was even longer than the last, filled with accusations of disturbing the peace and negligent parenting. She demanded immediate action and insisted that child-related disturbances be placed on the next meeting's agenda. She even threatened to escalate to county officials if the HOA didn't enforce her demands. But something had shifted, and it wasn't in her favor. By this point, the board had received more than a dozen counter-emails from other neighbors. Parents described how absurd it was to call the police on children. They explained how dangerous it could have been, frightening innocent kids who now associated law enforcement with punishment for simply playing. Others pointed out that Karen's constant complaints were creating more tension than anything else on the street. The HOA board, usually cautious and eager to avoid conflict, was beginning to grow tired of her antics. They didn't say it outright, but their silence in response to her demands said enough. But Karen didn't pick up on the subtle signs. She still believed she had the upper hand. The real turning point came at the next monthly HOA meeting, held at the community clubhouse. Normally, only a handful of homeowners showed up, most preferring to skip the dry discussions about budgets and landscaping. But this time, nearly everyone on the street was there. Word had spread, and people were ready to speak their minds. Karen arrived early, dressed as though she were about to present evidence in court. She carried a thick binder filled with photos, notes, and printed copies of emails. She sat in the front row, her chin lifted, radiating self-importance. She believed she was about to rally the board to her side, to cement her crusade against the so-called nuisance of children at play. But she miscalculated. When the floor opened for concerns, she was the first to speak. She flipped through her binder, projecting photos of chalk drawings on the screen, as if they were vandalism. She described the laughter of children as screeching and insisted that allowing such behavior would drag down the value of their homes. Her speech was long, dramatic, and dripping with indignation. Then came the response. One by one, neighbors stood up, not to support her, but to push back. Parents described how their children had been frightened when police showed up, and how unacceptable it was for a grown adult to involve law enforcement over kids being kids. Another neighbor reminded everyone of Karen's long history of nitpicking, from leaving angry notes about garbage bins to filing reports over parked cars that weren't violations at all. It wasn't just parents who spoke either. Older residents, those without kids at home, voiced their disapproval too. They explained that laughter and activity brought life to the neighborhood, and that silencing children was not the kind of community anyone wanted to live in. The mood in the room shifted entirely. It became clear, even to the board, that Karen was no longer the voice of reason she imagined herself to be. She was the problem. Karen sat frozen, flipping through her binder as though the evidence inside could somehow rescue her. But no one cared about her photos of chalk or her timestamps of noise incidents. The more she tried to justify herself, the more the crowd turned against her. The board, clearly uncomfortable, didn't outright condemn her, but they did something even more telling. They moved on. They ignored her demands, choosing instead to focus on unrelated agenda items. For someone like Karen, who thrived on attention and authority, being dismissed like that was the ultimate humiliation. When the meeting ended, she stormed out without a word, but everyone could see the fury in her face. That night, the street buzzed with quiet conversations. People felt relieved, almost triumphant. For the first time in a long while, Karen's power seemed to be fading. She wasn't untouchable anymore. Still, no one fully trusted that she would stop. Everyone knew Karen too well. She was stubborn, and she didn't take humiliation lightly. The question wasn't whether she would retaliate, but how. And they didn't have to wait long to find out. Because within a week, Karen had escalated again. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes, written in bold fonts, warning of unruly children and potential hazards. She claimed to represent concerned homeowners and hinted that if families didn't control their kids, there could be legal consequences. But this time, the reaction was swift and united. Neighbors began tearing up the flyers as soon as they arrived, some even posting on community forums to call her out by name. What she thought would rally support only deepened her isolation. And then, the final straw came. A video surfaced. One of the parents had recorded Karen during her outburst at the clubhouse meeting. The video showed her pointing at photos of children's chalk drawings and describing them as criminal mischief. The clip spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People laughed, people shook their heads, and people shared it with friends. Karen wasn't just a nuisance anymore, she was a joke, and for someone like her, being laughed at was worse than being hated. But Karen wasn't about to go down quietly. If the neighbors wanted a fight, she was determined to give them one. The video of Karen at the clubhouse meeting was the spark that lit the fire. It wasn't a slick production or something meant to go viral. It was just a shaky phone recording, a neighbor quietly holding their camera as Karen ranted about children's chalk drawings. But it didn't need fancy editing. The raw footage said it all. Karen's tone, her exaggerated hand gestures, her claim that smiley faces and hopscotch were criminal mischief. It was enough to make anyone shake their head. Neighbors sent the clip to one another, whispering about it over fences, texting it in group chats, and laughing about it in hushed voices at backyard gatherings. For once, Karen wasn't the one controlling the narrative. She was the subject of it, and not in the way she wanted. Karen, of course, found out. And when she did, her reaction was explosive. She fired off angry emails accusing people of harassment and character assassination. She claimed the video was edited and taken out of context. But no one bought it, because everyone had been there that night. They remembered every word. The video didn't distort the truth, it confirmed it, and that's when the tide truly turned. For years, Karen had wielded fear like a weapon. She used the HOA rules as a shield, her constant reports as a sword. People tolerated her because it was easier than fighting back. But once the laughter started, once the neighborhood stopped taking her seriously, her power collapsed. She could write as many flyers as she wanted, but no one read them. She could send complaint after complaint to the HOA, but the board had already grown tired of her. She could glare from her window, but now people waved back with amused smiles, mocking her unspoken threats. For Karen, this wasn't just frustrating, it was humiliating. She tried to reassert control. She called another police complaint, this time claiming the children were blocking traffic while playing basketball. But when the officer arrived, he found nothing more than a few kids shooting hoops at the end of a driveway. He gave a polite nod to the parents, then left without writing a report. Word of that incident spread quickly too, and the story only fueled the neighborhood's growing disdain. Next, she attempted to escalate through the county. She filed a formal noise complaint, filling out paperwork and citing disturbances of the peace. But when county officials investigated, they found nothing unusual. Children playing outside during daylight hours didn't violate any laws. The case was dismissed almost immediately. Every attempt Karen made backfired. Every move she thought would tighten her grip only loosened it further. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began to thrive in a way it hadn't before. Families grew closer. Kids from different households played together regularly. Parents organized impromptu block parties, complete with grills, lawn chairs, and music. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another in years now laughed side by side. There was a shared sense of unity, born out of standing together against the one person who had tried to divide them. Karen watched all of this from her window. She couldn't avoid it. The street she once thought she controlled was now alive in ways she couldn't silence. The sound of children's laughter, the smell of barbecues, the chatter of families, it was everywhere. And it wasn't just that she couldn't stop it. It was that everyone knew she wanted to. Her reputation was ruined. She had gone from being the strict neighbor people quietly tiptoed around to the subject of open jokes. People stopped pretending to respect her complaints. They stopped hiding their annoyance. And once the mask of authority was gone, Karen was just Karen, a bitter woman whose power had evaporated. The final blow came from the HOA itself. At the next meeting, without even naming her, the board announced new guidelines for complaint submissions. Moving forward, frivolous or repeated reports without merit would no longer be considered. They emphasized the importance of constructive community spirit and reminded everyone that the role of the HOA was not to micromanage everyday life, but to foster a positive environment. It was a direct message, and everyone knew who it was aimed at. Karen sat silently in the back of the room, her binder unopened, her expression tight. For the first time, she didn't stand up to speak. She didn't hand out flyers or demand attention. She just left quietly, her presence smaller than it had ever been before. From then on, Karen faded into the background. She still lived on the street, still peeked through her blinds, but her reign of control was over. Neighbors stopped catering to her whims, stopped fearing her reports, and stopped letting her dictate their lives. She had isolated herself completely. As for the kids, life went on. They played, they laughed, they drew chalk rainbows and flowers across the sidewalks, and every time their joy echoed through the cul-de-sac, it was a reminder that Karen had lost. Because in the end, the neighborhood had chosen laughter over silence, community over control, and unity over fear. Karen had tried to turn the street against the children, but instead, the street had turned against her. Her legacy wasn't authority. It was a cautionary tale, a story families would retell about the woman who called the cops on kids, only to end up the most disliked person in the neighborhood. And the truth was simple. Karen had hated children playing outside, but in trying to silence them, she had only amplified their voices, and the louder they laughed, the more powerless she became. That was the real ending to her story. The street didn't belong to Karen anymore. It never had. It belonged to the families who lived there, to the children who filled it with joy, and to the neighbors who finally decided that enough was enough. Karen lost her battle, and the neighborhood won its peace, not the silence she wanted, but the harmony they all deserved.